Good morning. This is Dr. Obutashaka, and this is the Dr. Obutashaka Show. I cooked up something for you this morning that I hope you find edifying. And I hope that you've been getting something out of these other shows. And I want to thank some of the viewers who have come forward and offered to help to improve the show and to promote the show. As I always do, I want to remind viewers who haven't subscribed to subscribe to the Dr. Obutashaka Show. This is extremely important because it enriches our algorithms and it makes us do better. And we're trying to increase the viewership for this show. The topic for today is going to demonstrate just how central the sixfold stages to mental freedom is for our people. And it's also going to really illustrate just how important African culture and what I call new African culture is for our people and for our going forward in terms of reviving and strengthening what we have, our families, our communities, and in the world where we're running nations, our nations. And so this is going to be really looking at some of the central principles in our culture and how they work in revitalizing African and African-American families, communities, and nations. But it's really going to show you how the awakening process really works by using some live examples. So we talk about the sixfold stages to mental freedom. It's an experience. It's not just a listing of steps and stages. It's an experience. So the topic for today is revitalizing Black communities, an act of culture. And we're going to be looking at Black Lives Matter and Colin Kapernick as examples for how we're going about this process and at least identifying the central principles that drive some of this transformation. And it'll encourage us to even be more conscious of what we're doing and the cultural principles that we're drawing from as we do this. So this is going to be some practical look at how our culture works in community revitalization, which includes family revitalization and national revitalization. Previous shows of this Dr. Obutashaka show have focused on a number of themes. And I hope you note that the method that I'm using as a historian is a method of making the past serve the present. And so we're drawing from the past certain principles that we can use today. And then we're also looking at how our people have done that in constructing a culture here. And so this is a method that's practical as opposed to just digesting information. This is for the purpose of liberation. So in the past, I've been looking at a number of themes that have come out of our history. And these themes have centered around how we can use the history to free our minds. But the central focus or central emphasis has been on the foundations of African and world history. So I've focused on neglected topics because I found them to be seminal and foundational. And this has come out of the discoveries that I made when I had the vision that gave birth to Return to the African Mother principle of male and female equality. And this work is the most important work that I've done. And in identifying the Twa as really the source of just societies, then it gave me a picture for how the Twa serve as the foundation for hooking up African civilization in general. And so my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, is really an extension of the mother principle because it is taking the Twa principle and taking it to another level by looking at how Twa societies were organized, their central principles, and then how they contributed to the development of agriculture and agrarian democracies, and then how they emerged full-blown in Kemet in the Anu as agrarian Twa. So the mother principle has been real seminal in identifying the Twa as the first makers of history, the shapers of the philosophy of African societies and African people, and the creators of the first family systems, governance systems, and at the hunter-gatherer level, economies. But the principles that Africans drew from for 100,000 years of hunter-gatherer existence before they innovated agriculture served as the foundation for subsequent societies. No historian that I know of has made this connection because generally, while some of our historians who I've drawn from, like Clyde Ahmed Winters, Brunson, and Runoko Rashidi, have used the Twa as a model in terms of history and have brought out some very important information, and other scholars are as well. The connecting link to how that serves as the formation and foundation of African civilizations on a very specific level, on the level of agricultural societies, on the level of families, on the level of village organization, on the level of government, and on the level of spirituality, philosophy, and many other things. That cohesive a link has not been made. And that's generally because the Twa have been put in the field of anthropology and taken outside of history. So the themes that have been stressed in this show have been themes that have been coherent. And they have looked at the Twa as the origin of civilization, and then taking you through the Anu and their role in birthing Kemet, and then looking at how the foundation of these civilizations give birth to political ideals such as Pan-Africanism and contribute to the formation of African-American culture. So these have been themes that have been central, and I try to link these shows up so that they flow the way music flows, good jazz or good blues or whatever your favorite expression is, good rap, whatever. So one of my reasons for launching this show was so that I could share my 61 years of experience as an organizer and 58 years of experience as a scholar with a broad audience, but with a special emphasis on the youth. I want to bring in Africans of all ages, people of color of all ages, and humanity. I mean, anyone that's interested in this that can use this in their own lives or in their own communities or their own nations, that's good. But a special emphasis in this show is on the youth because they're the future. And they're the ones that are going to carry us to the next level. And I've been tired of seeing too many people in my age group talk to the choir, talk to the same people. And so this is the real nuts and guts of this show, is to especially have an intergenerational dialogue. And I'm appreciative of the fact that we've had a lot of young people that have expressed an interest. So this has been a reason that I've done this show, and I'm doing this show and enjoy doing it. What I haven't discussed is that one of the main reasons for doing this show, in addition to grounding it on the sixfold stages to mental freedom and reaching as broad an audience as possible, especially the youth, is that I wanted to use this as a platform for using history and culture, philosophy and politics, spirituality, as a way to shape leadership, to help develop it, and to engage in intergenerational leadership and organizing training. So what I haven't discussed before is that I have created, and it's been in operation for some time, a leadership institute, which I'm using this platform. I'm going to be using this platform to offer classes and whatnot. But what I've been doing so far has been the foundation for this Leadership Institute. And this institute is called the P.A.P.O, House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Organizer Institute. And this is a picture of the symbols that drive this institute. It's kind of hard for you to see, but at the center, where you have this square, is a S.A.R.E, and a S.A.R.E is standing on 9 bows. And then in what would be my left upper right-hand corner is Horus. The left-hand corner is Tehuti, the netter of wisdom. And then below him, on the bottom right-hand corner, is Aset, his wife, and Nephthys, his sister-in-law, who's married to Set. And then on the side, you see Amilcar Cabral and Ella Baker. And on the top, you see a figure who is moving from east to west with his or her hands outstretched in a northern and southerly direction. And I'll explain this in a minute, but the key point is I'm using the highest educational system in the world, shaped by the ancient Kemites, and adapting it to modern day realities to use 2 methods, the sixfold stages to mental freedom, and the method used in P.A.P.O, which was the transformational or initiatory process that I'm describing in the book that I'm finishing on Seba. So I've been doing some training in this for a while, and some of it has been secret. We've done some war training where we had to train some people to smash some stuff that was very oppressive. And we took them through a 3-month training process of 9 hours on Saturdays, training them in martial arts and training them in public speaking and training them in strategies and tactics and organizing techniques. And these were young people who average age in their 20s who have outstanding organizing skills already. But we're teaching them some strategic skills for turning some very bad things around. And they did it. I can't tell you what it was because that was secretive. And it went off like clockwork because I'm a perfectionist and I've lost no battles. I'm a strategist. So if I train you in something, baby, give me all the elements and I'll show you how to win. But we had some brainy people. So, and a lot of them sisters and some brothers, young people, and they did a great job. And I had my team helping me. These are people that I've worked with since the 70s, who are themselves masters in different realms of organizing and different areas, and who have gone through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. So this is not something that I'm thinking about doing. I've been doing it, and I want to use this platform as a means for taking this to another level. And the people who enroll in the sixfold stages to mental freedom, they will be going through part of this initiation. And this is something I went through in the Black Freedom Movement. It was a discovery. I didn't understand the systems I was going through until I was going through them. And in the case of the sixfold stages to mental freedom, we had not identified it. So myself, and as I pointed out before, Bulanlela Wabogo and I have identified these stages, but this was an experience. This is what shaped me to be what I am, and as well as going through the Dogon African-American mastery system, which the book on Seba will heavily focus on. So I'm preparing you for this because this is one of the central reasons that I did this show. I had to consult people that I work with, some of whom have been my former students. They're in their 70s now, and ask them, do you think this is doable on the internet? And because time is a key factor, yes, but there are other prerequisites for this to work anywhere, and you'll see what those are as we go through them. So again, per Ankh, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker, House of Life Leadership Organizer Institute. I picked, so this is an adaptation of the Kemetic system to modern realities. You might call me a modern traditionalist, or you might call me a revolutionary traditionalist, in that there's a tradition in ancient Kemet called Septepi. Septepi meant first occasion. So this was the beginning, when happening happened, to use the Kemetic expression. And so anytime the Kemites would go through change or transformation, they would try and return to what's called Septepi, S-E-P-T-E-P-Y, which is the first occasion. Now, when Europeans do revolutions, they try and tear everything down to bring in something new, but they discover later through their psychologists and others that they are repeating their past. Because if you have the Russian Revolution, Stalin ended up being a new czar, you know, and in many ways more vicious than the old czars, killing off all his revolutionaries, killing off almost all his military leadership, killing off a whole lot of farmers. He got pleasure in killing, you know, which I'm not going to say the other revolutionaries in the Russian Revolution didn't, because they employed terror, you know, which meant violence just to keep people under control. That's a part of Aryan culture. So you got to understand that. But the key point is, for them, revolution, they thought, was tearing down something and bringing in something completely new. In China, you had Mao Zedong, who was really considered the emperor. Of course, he was conscious of the fact that he was continuing a lot of the emperor system of China, and would go back to the old books of China, as he should have, and draw from the wisdom of the elders. But it was a system where pretty much the emperor had the final say, and Mao had the final say. And he did a great job at certain points, and then he wasn't so good at other points. He was good in the armed struggle. He wasn't good in the economic component. You know what I mean? So S.N.C.C for African people isn't just tearing everything down. No, S.N.C.C is going back to the first occasion when things were most just and then drawing from that. So when P.A.P.O ends up being pharaoh in the 25th dynasty, you have the Shabaka stone that is written that is referring to the first occasion. And you have the building of step pyramids that go back to the third dynasty, to Imhotep's step pyramids, the first pyramids built in Kemet. And you have P.A.P.O giving his sister the power to run Kemet because there's a male-female thing going on there. So they're going back to first principles, to the time in which Kemet was most just, because they're at, is what John Henry Clark called the last walk in the sun. Kemet is going down. And so this is an attempt to revive it by going back to first principles. So I don't deny the fact that I draw from first principles, but then also believe you got to draw on new ones. You know, I'm a warrior, you know, a strategist. And so you don't ever come up with the battle plans the same twice. You always got to suit it to the situation. So I ain't just living in the past, but I draw from the best of the past to, you know, produce change today and tomorrow. And if you've got the longest period of human history in your belt, why shouldn't you? You know what I mean? So this show has drawn from themes of different aspects of African culture. And in this particular case, with the P.A.P.O House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute, it's drawing from that. It's drawing from the culture of Africans in the United States and globally, and using it to shape leadership training. So this is an adaptation. We're not just living in the past. We're drawing from the best principles of the past, but we're bringing in the present and the masters of the present. And that's why this is called the Amilcar Cabral Ella Baker Leadership Organizers Institute. As you've seen in just about every show, Amilcar Cabral is over my left shoulder there in the background with the sunglasses on. And he still serves as inspiration for me because of his brilliance and his effectiveness as an organizer. So this adaptation is in part drawing from the best of the organizing and leadership strategies, tactics, philosophies shaped by our best people. We're not just relying on them, but they are models for excellence that we should draw from. So Amilcar Cabral is a central model in the P.A.P.O House of Life Institute, because in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, while he led a small revolution in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, Amilcar Cabral was the best leader, organizer, thinker among activists in the 20th century. I'm not talking about people just write books. And I think he was superior to them as well. And he never claimed that. He was too humble and probably didn't even think about it, because during his particular time, he was too busy organizing an armed struggle against the Portuguese, who were very vicious. And so why do many of us, myself especially, consider Cabral the best? One, he had gone through the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Now, not all leaders need to. Nyerere didn't, but Cabral did. Anyone that's been assimilated definitely needs this, but people who haven't also need it, because Black culture in the US also needs revitalization. It is very strong, and Black identity, which it draws from, has created some very strong people, but there are some weaknesses in it. And the biggest one, as I pointed out before, is a lack of historical memory, historical amnesia. And so it's very important that in going through the sixfold stages, if someone comes out of Black culture, as say a Martin Luther King did, or an Ella Baker did, or John Coltrane did, they didn't assimilate, but there are features of African-American culture that need to be strengthened. And one of them is restoring our memory, you know? But for those who like Cabral or myself or Malcolm or many others, or you saw Theophilo Benga talk about his experience with assimilation, those who have been assimilated, then the sixfold stages really hook you up to your roots, to your people. And so Cabral is, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, the best leader, organizer, and thinker in the 20th century, first because he had undergone transformation of identity, and that enabled him to love himself and love his people. And this is a key quality, a key quality. If you've got leadership that's arrogant and doesn't like itself, which arrogance is a reflection of, they're not going to like their people. And as a result, they're likely to do anything when they get power. So this is the first reason that the P.A.P.O House of Life Leadership Institute is centered on him as an example. It's not that we're going to copy everything he did, but he's a model for excellence. The second reason that Cabral is considered by me and many others as the greatest leader of the 20th century is that he did the best analysis of social structure done by any scholar or leader in the 20th century. Now, I've recommended before that people should read Lerone Bennett's book, Negro Mood. That is the best analysis of the Black elite in this country, called Black Establishment. Best analysis, and hardly nobody's read it. And C. Wright Mills is like the sociologist in this country who innovated on analyzing the white power elite. He wrote a book called Power Elite. And there's a guy named Dumhoff, whose research I'm looking at right now. Been looking at his stuff, but I've been reading it for a while, called Who Rules America Now? It's a second edition of his first edition, which was Who Rules America? And that's the best analysis that's been made in this country of the ruling class of this country. But it's lacking. There's a lot that's needed. And so I'm doing research on his stuff, but I'm doing my own and coming up with some more stuff. So those are good analyses. And others have done their analysis of the power elite. And in the case of the Marxists, they have done a class analysis, which is interesting. But Cabral's is the best. Why? Because as an agronomist, he traveled throughout Guinea-Bissau, and under the cover of doing an agricultural survey sponsored by the Portuguese, because they liked Cabral, he was one of their most brilliant students to come out of their school of agronomy. They didn't know that during the day he was doing agricultural work, and at night he was organizing the PAIGC, Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. You know, they didn't know that. But the main thing is he went throughout Guinea-Bissau and he engaged the people in dialogues and stuff and did a study on how they were organized. How were the people who were democratic and had no kings, how were they organized? How were the people who were strategized, many of whom were Islamic? How was that structured? And he put this together. And that became the basis for his organizing. It is the most accurate analysis of social structure done by any scholar or leader in the 20th century, in my opinion, you know? And by the way, as an organizer in the only successful Northern Freedom Movement, one of my first lessons about social structure was the interplay of class and race among Blacks. A lot of Afrocentric people don't study class. there's a thing called ass and there's a thing called class. And sometimes some of the people on the very top act like the first. But the key thing is there is a class reality among Black folks, and it starts in the plantation with house slaves and field slaves, you know? And then out of that comes what becomes the class structure among Blacks. And it's a mixture of caste and class. When I met Julius Nyerere in 1977, one of the perceptive observations he made was that whites in the world serve as a caste and they sit over Blacks. And he's talking about Africans in the world. And so he's talking about how a white person could come into Tanzania, and just because he was white, it gave him status. So that's caste. That goes back to India. I won't go into that today. And then there's class. So in this country, caste, which is based on race, and class get merged. And that's a whole nother discussion. But that was one of my real educations, was in the movement of seeing how certain middle-class Blacks, who in this case were political, behaved and struggled. And there were some who, like Nat Burbridge, who had 2 PhDs in pharmacology and medicine and led the NAACP. He was one of the foremost militant leaders of the NAACP at the grassroots level in the 60s. He sided with the people. And then on the other hand, you had others who were simply out for ambition and who wanted to assimilate into the white man's system in some high position, and very often were prepared to sell Black people out. And so that was a real education for me. And it gave me some insights and whatnot. And that was a problem Cabral had, because Cabral was training people. They were not university trained, but he was trying to create a skilled group of Blacks that could run Guinea-Bissau. But he knew he was going to have problems, because they got into power, they would probably want to wield it for their own benefit against their people. So he was using the 6-fold stages to mental freedom. He didn't call it that, but the de-assimilation process to get them to be loyal to the people. He was trying to do that. But his analysis of social structure made Cabral the most perceptive thinker of any of our leaders. And that enabled him to then go on the ground and organize effectively, because he knew how each group would behave. He didn't get this out of a book. He went and studied the people, learned from the people. So that was the second reason that Cabral was the best in the world. And to say that is saying a lot, meaning better than Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a great leader, great man. Malcolm X and him had the same birthday. Malcolm X, you know what I mean? Saying greater than them. Ella Baker saying greater than her. And Ella Baker is key here, because she's one of the greatest we've produced, Mao Zedong, greater than him. You know what I mean? Castro, he's on the top of the litter, in my opinion. And the third reason for picking him is that while his country was small, a couple 100,000 people, his military record was the best. And what do I mean by that? He inflicted a high death rate on the Portuguese and their flunkies. Unfortunately, they were African. Over 58,000 Portuguese were killed by Cabral's soldiers. Cabral lost something like 2,500 soldiers. High casualty rate on his enemy, lost very few lives among his own soldiers, but also he had a humane battle, ethic. And it was that he didn't kill women, he didn't kill children, he didn't kill elders, And that's very hard to do when you're in an armed struggle. But humanity drove Cabral, and that's why his casualty rates were low. Also, because he valued life. African life and even the lives of his enemies. And by the way, Cabral's policy on low casualty rates for his own people, and even though high number of Portuguese died, that's part of the reason why they ended up overthrowing their government, which he predicted would happen. But part of the reason was his humanistic policies, of not just going in and doing wholesale slaughter. But the main thing is he saw if he lost more than one person, if he lost one person, it was bad. If he lost two or three for Cabral, that was a catastrophe. And so Cabral did everything he could to see that those casualties were low. And I see a question here on surveys on the Black community. I have to get this question thing pulled out so I can see it better. But I've used this survey method a lot in organizing myself, in organizing, because you can't assume where your people are at. You got to go and find out. So Cabral is the model of one of the models we draw from in the P.A.P.O House of Life, Amilcar Cabral Elevator Leadership Institute. So just to summarize with him, Cabral is picked because he combines three essential qualities of a leader organizer. First, a strong sense of African identity and self-love and love of African people and of humanity. Secondly, his theory was in line with his practice. In other words, his ideas could walk. They reflected reality. And this is real key. We had a lot of brilliant people. They come up with a lot of ideas. I have a friend named Leon Dixon who says 90% of our ideas are no good. They may sound good, but put them on the ground and see if they walk. Cabral's stuff walked. So Cabral is picked because he combined theory with practice, and his theory was practical. And then he had a practical method for training organizers and training leaders. Very simple, very practical. So Cabral. Miss Elevator, and in the movement, our elder sisters were referred to as Miss, and the brothers as Mr. And Miss Elevator is selected as the other symbol for P.A.P.O. And she's picked because she was one of the two best leader organizers of the 60s, Malcolm X being the other. It's very hard to say that either one was better than the other. I used to think Malcolm was the best, but then as I've studied Ella Baker in depth, she's one of the masters in the book on Seba that I'm finishing. I realized it was like apples and oranges. You really can't say one's better than the other, because Miss Baker's record of organizing, leading, and thinking was bad. I mean, bad. And most important, her method and her philosophy of organizing and leading is best suited for today. And that is the notion of group-centered leadership. This is the form of leadership that we need today in the US and I think around the world. And this is because our communities have been put in a position where they've been fragmented due to the powerful forces that hit our communities since 1968, leading to a choice between two cultures, breaking down families, breaking down extended family communities, weakening the relationship between the young and the old through the violence of the drug traffic, and a host of other forces. And so in this period, the single charismatic leader just is not going to be able to address the issues. That's kind of like the horse and buggy stage. That was okay for the 60s. But now the realities have become far more complex. And the Miss Ella Baker model, which itself has a history that I'm going to go into in a minute, is the model best suited for revitalizing families and communities and nations today. And the leader for Black Lives Matter has consciously drawn from this model, which means the younger generation, the conscious element of the younger generation appreciates and has studied this history and has actually improved upon this in many ways, because they have to, given how fragmented our communities are. Then the amount of people involved in leadership and organizing is going to be much greater. It's going to just be a whole lot of things that you're going to have to improvise on now. And this is the best model for that. So if we're going to rebuild African and African-American families, communities, and nations, then we have to draw from the best features of African culture and new African culture. And liberation movements, as Cabral pointed out, are expressions of culture or acts of culture, and often are not aware of it. We have to become more aware of what we're drawing from and be selective in what we use. And so the strategies and programs needed to revitalize families and communities and nations have to come from the best features of our culture, both New African and African culture. Now, so Ella Baker was picked because she's not only the best organizer, but she was also what I call a situational revolutionary thinker. And this was very important in terms of her innovation. She comes out of a culture that is heavily situational. We draw from some enduring principles. We talked about some of those last week in talking about the African Lodge. But then we're a culture that very much responds to the situations that are affecting our people. And Ella's thinking was situational. That really confused the oppressor. He really couldn't understand where she was coming from, because she was offering from her rich experience ideas suited to situations that would help Black people and anyone that wants to engage in transformation produce change in society. She was a revolutionary in a deep sense. And so she was not only a great organizer, and she was the principal influence on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. As many in S.N.C.C have said, no Ella Baker, no S.N.C.C, no Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she encouraged their inclination towards group-centered leadership, which was central to her views and to her organizing strategies, which she had practiced as director of organization of the NAACP, where she organized a huge number of NAACP chapters. And it was based on her respect for local leadership. And that's why when I compare Malcolm's style of organizing to hers, Malcolm's was disciplined. That was the nature of his personality and the nature of the Nation of Islam. He created the best disciplined organization in the history of Blacks in this country. And so that was good. And then what Ella Baker did is she created a mass base of chapters in the NAACP, and then encouraged S.N.C.C to use this same approach. And she had a network of relationships all over the country. So, but her philosophy of leadership came out of her culture coming out of North Carolina. And that culture goes back to Africa, which I'm going to be discussing. So the P.A.P.O, House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute is a format, it's a program that we're going to be using on this show. And the sixfold stages to mental freedom is at the foundation of it, as it is with the foundation of this show. So I hope to engage people who are engaged already in local struggles and want to bring their skills to the table. Young people who want to upgrade their organizing skills, but who have talent and want to share what they have. Masters who have done a lot of work already that want to do their sharing, and just about anybody, because leadership in its broadest sense is everyone's a leader. You have to be in charge of your own life, and that is key. And I'll be getting into how we define leadership in the African and African American context. And, I've written 2 volumes, Our Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, nearly 900 pages long, took me 10 years to write. And that comes out of my experience, the experience of our people, and the global experience of African people and successful movements all over the world. And so, we'll also be using that. So since the beginning of this show, there's been an exploration of the spiritual, cultural, historical, political, social, economic ideas that grow out of African-American culture. And key to the P.A.P.O system will be this system of being the truth. Knowing is a process of being. And so this process, which is in part what the sixfold stages of mental freedom is based on, but is also central to the learning method that African people use, that was used in P.A.P.O, is key to not only leadership, but generally how we grow and transform in life in general. So this will be key to the show. It has been, and in this leadership training as well. So we've been drawing from the culture of our past and of today to use it so that you can empower yourself. Now, there's going to be 3 focuses that I'm going to stress today, and 2 that are central, coming out of African culture and that are central to new African culture or African American culture. And these 3 principles are extremely important. One is the principle of the African conception of democracy and the African American conception of democracy, which is the same guiding principle of African American culture. 2 is the transformational system manifested in this case in the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And we'll be using an example. Colin Kapernick is going to be the example for how this is manifested in this stage of struggle among Black people today. And then 3, twin lineal families as a model. I will not put as much focus on this, but this is the most important thing I should point out. Twin lineal family model is really the model for us getting our act together. And that is contained in the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality. And this comes from God's beautiful light. There's no holes in this. And I'm going to tell you, if we're going to get our families back together, we're talking about revitalizing Black families, African families, Black extended family communities, African extended family communities, and it's good for humanity at large. The twin lineal family model is fundamental. And this will require, for me to go this in depth, this is going to require really going in depth into the mother principle, my most important work. It was harder to write this book than Beating the Bank of America, which was the biggest bank in the world. And that took 6 months. This book took 5 years to write, but it's not the time. When you get a vision from God, God's vision is whole. Within anything is everything. It's not linear. And so, and it's accurate. There's no holes in it. So I give credit to God for what I was able to come up with in the mother principle. It's written unlike any book I've ever written before. It's not linear. I'm linear. I'm a child of Obatala. You see me wear white a lot. That's Obatala's color. And I'm linear. Most Africans are not. Most Europeans are. You know what I mean? But when I wrote the book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, I made the point of not being linear. Why? Because I had received such a beautiful gift from God. After these 5 years of 3-month retreats, working on myself, after years of dealing with my identity, after years of struggle and Black liberation struggles, after years of, reading and study and working on myself, God was kind enough to share this beautiful light that gave me the formula for just societies. And so when I wrote the book, I knew the easiest way for me to write it would be linear and would be easy to understand. But my first thing was, and I use simple words when I write, so it's not hard to understand my language, but I was returning to God the beauty that God gave me, and I knew I couldn't even come close to the beauty of the beautiful light that I've talked about before. That light changed me. And so this was a return to God to say thank you. This was my thank you. And it was like, I don't know what it's like for a woman to give birth, but it was like giving birth. I don't know if it is, but I know that there was a lot of pain in terms of the process for coming to this. The changes that I went through over that 5-year period, that was rough. And then the writing was hard, but that's what I like. So hard, that wasn't the problem. And so in some ways, when the book was finished, I sent it to Dr. Asa Hilliard and 20 other scholars to review it. And I told you before, Dr. Carruthers, Jake from Chicago, gave me the most stinging critique, required me to tighten something up. He said, "You asked for it, didn't you?" And I tightened it up. And then when the book was finished, I carried it to John Henry Clark because he wrote one introduction. And then I mailed it to Dr. Asa Hilliard because I couldn't reach him physically. And I received a call from Asa on the phone, Dr. Asa Hilliard. For you that don't know, he was one of our great scholars, had been dean of the Department of Education at San Francisco State, was on my HRT committee. That's the Hiring and Retention and Tenure Committee. That's like in the union where if you get past this, you got a permanent job, you know what I mean? And the FBI was shooting at me. They were doing everything to deny me tenure. They had worked through a guy who was provost who had tried to break the strike. He was a criminology major, and he was seeing that an acting dean was writing me up. No student had ever complained on me in 40 years. I had never had one complaint. So it didn't come from students, but it was false write-up. So then I have to go back and write up something to show that it was false. But the point is, Asa was on my committee. He was chair of it. He was defending me with the administration. And then one day he calls me into his office and says, "Shaka," I've told you this before. He says, "Shaka, you won." So he helped. So when I sent the book to him, Asa left me a message on the phone. And he said, "I received the mother principle and I cried." That was Asa. That was the beauty of that man, you know? So I'm not going to be going into the twin lineal that much, but I'm going to tell you, of all the things that I've done, that work is most important. And it is key to revitalizing our families and communities, our nations. And it is key for you to get real, just, balanced, loving relationships, but it's also key for you getting a more balanced thing inside of yourself, you know? So these are the three things that I'll be focusing on today, but the main ones will be on African and African-American democracy and the transformational system through the six-fold stages to mental freedom. Now, in past shows, I've talked about Dr. Chancellor Williams, who was a great scholar. And by the way, I'll bring down another show, a picture of a picture that ties into that. My good friend, Kendi Soluwazi, whose pictures you see in the background of the people dancing. They're doing the dance, the bump. Kendi's my best friend. And I have that in the background because that's African-American culture. Then you've got the picture there of the black and gold you see behind you, or beige color. That's a S.A.R.E. And it's the process of opening the mouth ceremony in ancient Kemet. So, I have different things here illustrating stuff, behind me. But I referred to Chancellor Williams before, and in the interview or discussion that I had with Dr. Theophilo Benga, I went through the little known work, Rebirth of African Civilization, which I consider to be his best work. But I made reference to what most people are familiar with, his other classic work, and both of these are classics, The Destruction of Black Civilization. Now, one of the things that Dr. Chancellor Williams did is he did a lot of study, and a lot of it was field study. He went into Africa and actually studied African systems on the ground. And when he wrote the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, there's not a lot of footnotes, and there's a reason, because he had gone blind. So he couldn't often cite the particular citations, leading some of our scholars to question his work. But these were societies that he had gone in and observed, and then others he had studied. And I really want to stress, he studied in the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, neglected African societies, because we're usually into studying the big ones. We usually don't look at the smaller ones. And many of us, like the Igbo people, many of them that were enslaved, they came out of smaller, classless, age-grade societies. So he studied this carefully. And I think one of the reasons he did is, while he was pursuing his studies, these were advanced studies after PhD, but this was particularly to ground him in the study of African civilizations. He did studies at Oxford, which is Britain's best university. And he had a professor that he studied under named Madden. He's considered a great European historian. Because, the British, when they did their colonial thing, then they have their African Studies department. So this is one of the things that Chancellor Williams did, was go and check out their information. He was not relying on their information, but what he came up with, but he wanted to know where they were coming from. And so Madden makes this comment, and this ties into one of the central themes for today. Madden, and by the way, colonialism is always tied into the academy, just like imperialism is. I mean, people who are going to universities now, and particularly if you go to the best, you're being trained to service the empire. So you got a choice. Are you going to fall for that? Or are you going to decide to use those skills to service your people and extract from that what you can use and discard the rest and go back to your people and get re-educated, because you will have been messed up after the more prestigious these universities are, the better they are at messing you up. So Chancellor Williams is listening to a lecture by Madden. And what does Madden say? He's talking about the problem that the British colonizers were having in Africa. Their problem was they would get these kings who they had conquered, or create kings, because in the case of the Igbo, where many of them didn't have king, they went and created some. And so there's an old saying that these kings that had formerly been mouthpieces of the people became mouthpieces of the colonizer. And so they would give a king an order, and that king would then give, because that's called indirect rule. That ain't very indirect, but that was the British system, you know what I mean? They would allow you to maintain the facade of having your own system, but they ran it, just like they do with a lot of Negroes today. You know what I mean? You thinking you're listening to somebody really independent, but he's going back and getting orders from old master. You know what I mean? And so these kings would get orders, and so they'd issue them to the people. Now, under traditional systems, kings never gave orders. And I'll explain that in a minute. Explain why. And so every time they would come and give an order, the people would vote him out of office. And by the way, you don't know people could actually do that, because our idea often of kingship is not too much different from the European notion, except for Kemet, maybe because you know something about Kemet. You don't know about a lot of these inter-African systems. So Madden made the point that the reason that these Africans were throwing these kings out, and they couldn't impose on the people the British system of oppression, was because, and this is what Madden said, I'm quoting, their wild and most primitive system of democracy. Their most wild and primitive system of democracy. And so Madden, because he's, these professors who are considered outstanding, they're outstanding because they are giving advice to the colonizers, those who are on the ground, to how to implement their policies. And they're paid well for this too. And you have them in this country doing the same thing. And so Madden is advising, and of course, the British colonizers already knew this is what they had to do, but Madden is advising that the British must destroy this primitive African democracy. I suspect that it's when Chancellor Williams hears this, that he really gets alerted to this idea of African democracy. He may have already been doing some studying, but I really think that this contributed to his pursuing this in depth, something that most of our scholars have not done. And some of them question whether or not Africans practice these systems. And of course, as Dr. Theophila Benga said, in our discussion, there are many different kinds of democracy in the world, because in fact, what the West calls democracy really isn't democracy. And of course, there's an African form and there's an African-American form. The African-American and African form are the same. That's why you run around here talking about you ain't got no culture. Well, guess what? This is one of the governing principles of your culture. So this was key to Chancellor Williams' research, because what he did is go into Africa and do research on classless age grade societies, for example, the smaller societies that didn't have kings and queens, where government was based on ages. And of course, we know we use the rites of passage thing, which is taking one part of that, which is initiating young boys and girls into manhood. But people were grouped in society according to age. And government ran that way, basically. But it was based on a democratic principle. So Chancellor Williams studied this. Now, a lot of anthropologists have as well. It's not that this is not known. Ella Baker was an advocate of group-centered leadership, where the group was a leader, not a single leader. And this is the model that Black Lives Matter follows. This model goes back to the Twa. I've discussed this briefly before, but you need to understand the connection, that it is the Twa, and the British didn't understand this. They didn't understand where what they call this primitive wild democracy was coming from. Wild in the sense that the people were fighting the British. They weren't orderly, so they're wild, huh? Primitive, well, they use the term to mean backward, but if you mean original, first, yeah, you might have something there. Of course, they're discrediting this, putting this down, but it means it's popular. I mean, all across Africa, they face this same response. So Ella Baker's group-centered leadership model which is best suited for today, goes back to this democratic tradition that comes out of Africa. Now, if all you do is focus on Kemet, you might be blind to it because at least the top level, it's a pharaoh model. And so, you might think, well, yeah, that's the key thing. We really don't know how things worked at the local level in Kemet, except to know that women were central. They were key to taking care of their mothers and fathers if they were ill. They ran the agrarian economy as shepsuts, which I point out in the integration trap. Queen Hatshepsut's title comes from Shepsut, which, as I point out in the integration trap, was the woman farmer who was elected to hold office for 1 year by all of the female farmers. That they were the farmers of Kemet. And this is the person that interfaced with the pharaoh in pre-dynastic Kemet. By the way, pre-dynastic is not a good term. I've renamed it. I'm not going into that now. I've renamed it. You know what I mean? Pre-dynastic is not an accurate term, mainly pre-dynastic. Well, if they gave birth to dynasties, and C.O.R.E was the first one, we actually have a picture of him, he really existed, then how is this pre-dynastic? You know what I mean? That's an incorrect term. So I have a correct term. That's a whole nother thing. I ain't getting into it now. But the key point is, with Shepsut, we're being told that women wielded great power in Kemet. And we know Pharaoh couldn't get his office except through his sister, because the sister was the source of authority. Royalty came from the woman. If you look at Aset or Isis, the crown she wears is a throne. The throne is on top of her head. That's telling you she's the source of royal authority, of royal power. So at the grassroots level, the village level, women were playing a real big part in leadership, and they were at the pharaoh level in that they were the source of authority. And they were the symbols of justice, because it's the woman that wears the ostrich feather, the symbol of Ma'at. You know what I mean? But I'm stressing this. You can't put all your emphasis on Kemet. You got to look at Africa as a whole. And we can draw things from Kemet. We can draw things from inner Africa. And I think some of the best things we can draw are those that empower our people, because our power doesn't come from technology, though we need technology. I'm not knocking it. It doesn't come from controlling a nation state, though this nation state is going to get reshaped as the demographic shift in this country. But it comes from the people, in this case, the power of Black people. And so this democratic tradition is extremely important, and it plays a very important role in terms of revitalizing our families and our communities, and globally, our nations. So if we're going to be effective in our organizing, this group-centered leadership model has to be appreciated. So Ella Baker was an advocate of this. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee practiced this. Black Lives Matter, this has been a method that they've effectively used. This goes back to Twa hunter-gatherer societies. Some of our people think it goes back to the classless age grade societies. That's where Chancellor Williams traced the origin of democracy. He was right in that this was a very ancient system, but it's not the origin. The origin is hunter-gatherer societies. And they provide the model for subsequent African societies. I know that due to this vision, that I'm able to trace the root. And then when you trace the root, you see how everything else grows. So Twa hunter-gatherer societies gave birth to democracy in the world. Of course, this is a Greek term, this word democracy, but it's the idea of the people ruling. In that sense, the Twa give birth to it. Now, according to historians, and a lot of Black and African historians buy into this, they say that democracy originates with the Greeks in Athens in the 6th century BC. They also note that a number of Greek city-states also practice democracy. So they're going to say that that's the birthplace of democracy. Well, first of all, Europeans, for the most part, treat European history as world history. And so whatever they have is treated like that's a history of the world. Herodotus is treated as the father of history, though he never called himself that. And so whatever the Greeks innovate with or play with in terms of trying to give the people some say so, that's supposed to be the birthplace. But how can the 6th century BC, number one, which is the time when Athens comes up with what they call democracy, be the birthplace when hunter-gatherer societies start with 144,000 years ago? That's A, number one. But B, how do you call this a democracy when only 10% of the males of Athens could actually vote? And that this system of democracy only lasted for a very short period of time. So how is it that you even call this a democracy? And by the way, as we know, in the Greek system, only 10% of the males could vote. Generally, they were property owners. Women couldn't vote, and which is the same as here. This is recent that women have been allowed to vote in the Western world in general. And slaves obviously couldn't vote. And America and Greece and Rome, they share this in common, where the foundation of their economy, particularly in Greece and America, based on slave labor, us, who in this case aren't even regarded as human beings by the system, by white people. So to call a system where only 10% of the people had a say-so as democratic, where half of the population, which is female, is excluded, is democratic, is to really stretch the word and to stretch the concept. But the hunter-gatherer system gives birth to democracy because, and this is what I discovered in The Beautiful Light, it's based on all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society. So hunter-gatherer societies, men have no more power than women, women have no more power than men. They are equally empowered. That's the formula. That came from God, by the way. Those are not my words. Just like a choice between two cultures, that came from God. You hear me? And then I did my homework and started looking at all these different societies and then seeing how this was replicated after hunter-gatherer societies. I ain't going into that. But that is the basis for democracy, is the involvement of males and females. And that has to do with an overriding philosophy as well. And that is also why when you come up with kingly and queenly systems, the people who are doing the advising to the king and the queen, males and females, often males, the advice is given on the basis of consensus. In other words, kings and queens are bound by the consensus will of the people who are the most just people coming from the lineages in their society. I talked about this before, how the king of Ghana, the Asante, has the qualities of a lineage head, the most just, the most truthful, the most brave, the most honest, the one that never cursed, the one that never abused women, the woman who never turned his back on a war party, you know what I mean? The one who was respectful of the people, the best one, that was the one, you know what I mean? That one could only stay in office as long as he submitted to the will of his council. And when he didn't, he was out. You hear me? Gone. And that's why when the Africans get this colonial king, they're throwing him out because he's violating their tradition. So don't think the kingship meant in Africa what it meant in Europe. It was not based on the person who was the strongest, who's imposing his will on the people. Though it could be. Maybe he was a great warrior, maybe he wasn't. But the key thing is most just and subject to the will of the people. So this is at the heart of the democratic tradition of African people. And it governs African societies at all levels. And this is why Africa is in trouble today. The people's voice has been shut out, and particularly the voice of women, but men too, at the village level. They provide the food, which is the basic economy of Africa is agrarian, but they don't get no say so. They don't even get a fair price for what they grow, you know? So the future of Africa is dependent upon the people having a major say so, and that say so means restructuring. I've talked about this before, the nation state, so that people have a say so, and that's pulling from the best of African models. So it should be not surprising. If you know your culture, you will know that the African American or New African or Black person, the African in the Caribbean, the African in Africa, the African in Europe, the African in Asia, the African in South Pacific, guess what? Democracy, that is having a say-so, is a constituent part of the African's nature. Having a mouth, that is key to us. Black women in this country are a strong force. Why? That is the essence of them. They're going to have a say-so. You hear me? They're going to have a say-so. And that's always been the case. Now, we have patriarchy. We have Blacks who are bound to it because they're copying this white boy system. We have abuse. We had a lot of stuff. So slavery, and in the case of Africa, colonialism, has messed some of this up. But at the heart and soul of it, African woman cannot be defined as somebody who's lost their voice. You hear me? She got plenty of voice and plenty of mouth, and that is the truth of being an African woman. She is feminine. She knows how to do all those things that will drive a man crazy, but she's strong. And she can be strong in different ways. I know sisters who are physically delicate, and they will tell you in a minute, I may look that way, that's not the way I am. Meaning, yeah, I'm slender and, you know, got all these little delicate physical qualities, but I mean, if you check them out, they're a force of nature, you know? And so this is a part of this democratic tradition grounded in trilinealism. And that is really the core of African democracy. So when we look at African people in America, we see that this principle continues. It's key to African American or New African culture. And in the case of Africans in America, our culture was created democratically by everyday Black folks. Field Blacks created this culture. You're not aware of the process because it was secret. I mean, you know, in enslavement, Blacks were not advertising what they were doing, but they created right under the nose of the oppressor a new African culture. And there's not a single author. Black folks collectively came up with this, and it was basically drawn on fundamentals that were in their soul, fundamentals of African culture, and then reworking them into this environment, and then coming up with new stuff, and then having to deal with all the negatives that we still have to deal with coming from whites. So this becomes central to African-American culture. Now, with the end of slavery in this country, you have a real battle that takes the form of Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. And during the period of Reconstruction, there is a struggle over what kind of power a Black's going to have, because Blacks expected to get 40 acres and a mule. And for a long time, or for a period of time, the North was going to be satisfied with going back to the old system, just not reinstating slavery in a formal sense. And so, but it's when the South decides to wage a political war against the North through saying that they are going to allow goods coming from Europe to come in without a tariff, and not recognizing the national banks, they are waging an economic and political war. Then the North decides to empower Blacks with the vote. So we have the period of Black Reconstruction. And we're seeing now the same thing being repeated with the effort to strip Blacks of the vote. And then, we have the post-Reconstruction period where Blacks are stripped of the vote. And then what happens is there's a move by the states, the Southern states, to become the new slave masters. The state becomes the slave master. Frederick Douglass said, we moved from being slaves of individual masters to being slaves of society. The truth is, the states, Georgia, South Carolina, whatever, they were beginning to perform the role of being the new slave masters. Why? So they could control Black labor, and so that Blacks could become subservient under white control. And so Blacks are in a position where they had held some offices in Reconstruction. Some of them were sheriffs, some of them, Pinchback was a lieutenant governor in Louisiana, kind of a conservative one. You had Blacks serving in the Senate and in the House. And these offices are being taken back. Blacks are being bulldozed, which meant burned out of, these are terms coming from the grassroots, burned out of their homes, burned alive, raped, shot, everything else to take the power back. And what is it that Blacks have? They have this culture that they've recreated. I'm not going into the whole thing, but one of the things they have is this democratic tradition coming out of Africa, which they had been practicing on the plantation. It was just undercover. I mean, when you read someone like Frederick Douglass talking about how he didn't do anything without consulting his friends, who were the people that he loved more than any beings in life. He said the thought of them brought tears to his eyes. The African didn't move without getting advice. You hear me? And so at the end of enslavement, particularly during this post-Reconstruction period, where Blacks don't have no legal rights, we're going back on these constituent principles, a constituent part of our nature, which is having a say-so and making decisions based on that. And so when Blacks have serious issues they're facing, issues of the Klan, all kinds of issues of rabid violence that they're facing, they're coming together in groups. They're very careful about who they bring into their groups too, because if they figure somebody is a traitor, they're not bringing them in. But generally they have broad groups and they are debating out what their position is going to be. Their decisions are made by consensus, which is the African method that goes back to the Chwa. And then they get slick. They pick a person that they figure whites would feel comfortable with. They called them representative men and women of color. And these were Blacks with a little bit of education, They didn't split their verbs so much. And they were more assimilated. But they were sent to the whites with a message, but the message came from the people. And then that's how things were being handled. And whenever one of these representative men and women of color began to get their own ideas that went against the will of the people would turn their back on them. Just as in Africa, they were throwing out chiefs because they were issuing orders against their own will. So Blacks were doing the same thing here. We were turning our backs on people who were coming up with ideas after being given the position of delivering a message from Blacks, which means they were a spokesperson. Now they think they're a leader where they can direct people to do whatever they want them to do. And when they did that, the people said, oh no. And this was particularly during the period in which a lot of Blacks wanted to immigrate out of the South because the terror was so heavy. They were going into Kansas. Many of them wanted to go back to Africa, but they wanted to get the hell out of there. And when these representative men and women of color hear this, what do they say? No, this isn't a good idea. When they went up against the will of the people, they weren't heard. So they found out they weren't leaders. And by the way, Frederick Douglass, who was a great leader of Blacks, in the sense that he spoke up and stood up against enslavement. He had been a slave himself. Brilliant man. He had his own issues, in terms of identity and stuff like that, but, a great man. But with the end of Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, grassroots Blacks, and in my book, The Art of Leadership, I quote this, grassroots Blacks would say of him, and this isn't knocking, this is just reality. They would say, Frederick Douglass is no national leader. And they would say the reason why is usually when he comes to speak among us, we have to pay to hear him. That's number one. But number two, they said, he's not our leader because to be our leader, you have to live among us. You have to know what we want. And you have to be able to push that, to support that. And because he's living off close to Washington, D.C., he's kind of isolated from the people. They respected him. They weren't putting him down. They're just simply saying that they were their own leaders. It was the people who lived among them who were the mouthpieces of the people if they chose to have them play that role. And but they were their own leaders. They were following this group leadership principle that Ella Baker favored that comes out of the hunter-gatherer societies. You understand? So this is the root of this. This is at the core of Black folks. When Black people decide to embrace Christianity, which many of you think was shoved down our throat, no, it wasn't. You think your people are stupid if you think that. Why would we embrace Christianity when the worst of everything we saw came from that? When we did, it was on our terms. We dropped what we have been practicing for 249 years into what gets called the Black church. And what churches did we pick? The ones that gave us the say-so. The ones where we could, practice our democracy. That was Baptist and Methodist. That's why we picked them. We picked them because it was a vehicle for housing our own practices. And as great as AME is, African Methodist Episcopal Church, it's small among Black people. The Nation of Islam, as great as it is, or has been as an organization in cleaning people up off drugs and setting up schools and businesses and whatnot, whatever the negatives that we've explored, with Malcolm and stuff like that, the Nation did a lot of good things. And, by standards of organization, they had a fair amount of members. But if you're going to compare them to the religious organizations of our people, small in numbers, why? The people got to have a say-so. You hear me? Ain't too many of us joining groups unless we're running them. You hear me? And you really miss it with Black folks. Black folks, and having this idea of running their own organization, that's organizational nationalism. And Blacks of all stripes practice that one. And as I pointed out before, as one slave narrative said, one enslaved African said, only the blacks can move the blacks. You hear me? And so when Malcolm was criticizing King for being a Tom and claiming that he was representing a white people, as far from the truth as you could talk. Because the people picked him as a spokesperson. As King said, I didn't start the Montgomery bus boycott, but when the people called on me, I stepped forward as a spokesperson. Yeah, he came up with nonviolence, which is the people weren't calling for, but it happened to be an effective tactic. It was his way of life, but for the people, it worked. It got you voter rights legislation. It got you desegregation legislation. So it worked. And Malcolm didn't believe half that stuff, because we know that King and Malcolm shared an attorney. And he was always asking him, what did King think about him? And you saw that picture where they both met, both grinning. You know what I mean? Malcolm had a lot of respect for King. And Malcolm was getting closer to King, and King was getting closer to Malcolm. So let's not get too fooled on all of this division and stuff. And as bad as the Nation of Islam was, I don't see them taking up any kind of armed action against the police or against any arm of this system, including the Ku Klux Klan. I didn't see that happen either. So if you're going to talk about nonviolence, well, and I'm not criticizing for not doing it. I'm simply saying it didn't happen. So, so the key thing is that democracy has been at the key of our power, and it was key to our power also because we were drawn on the wisdom of the group, and the wisdom of the group was shaping how we moved. And in our democratic traditions, we were drawing also from elders, because the institution of elderhood, they advised these groups of blacks who are making decisions. And that was the success of the San Francisco Freedom Movement. Our decisions were consensus. That was my policy. I've explained before. I didn't know that much about African democracy, but it's a constituent part of my nature. So it came up. I just knew that if we had a collective, a consensus decision-making, we'd make fewer mistakes. And I don't like making mistakes. And when you're in battle, that can be deadly. I don't like losing either. You know what I mean? And so we drew from the wisdom of the people. And it also instilled a sense of power and respect in people. And we're showing respect for people's ideas. And one of the worst things any of our organizations can do is come up with this singular leadership and idolize people. And then they prove to be human. And then they start doing all kinds of stupid things, because that's what individuals do. And then if power intoxicates them, then they do all kinds of stuff. And I could be naming people, I'm not. But if you know anything about the history of some of these movements, you'll know what happened with some of them, that people became intoxicated with power. And a lot of people who are really putting their lives on the line got hurt as a result of that. So this democratic tradition has been key for our people. It is key to the success of anything that we do, that the people have a major say-so, and it's the key to empowerment and everything else. When Ferguson kicks off, you have a flame that is beginning to grow larger in Ferguson. And the people of Ferguson have to be given real credit for being the powder keg that ignites this whole anti-police violence movement that gets called Black Lives Matter. It gets hashtagged as Black Lives Matter. Michael Brown's murder at the hands of the police. That was a flame, and it brought in gangsters. There were gangsters coming into Ferguson who had their own grievances and were inspired by this. And some of them may have changed, I don't know, And this flame, it burned in Ferguson for some time, and then it spread. And this was a democratic fire. It was the people saying, we're sick and tired of the police blowing us away. We're tired of it. And we're standing up against it. And so when sisters come up and coin the term Black Lives Matter, that was, again, an expression of humanism. It was just simply saying that you can't blow our brothers away or sisters away, and we're not going to do anything about it. This is blood of our blood, flesh of our flesh. We love them. You know what I mean? And we're not going to allow this to happen. And so that hashtag was brilliant, and it summarized the attitudes of our people, and heavily the attitudes of sisters. Because with this group-centered leadership, as families have been fragmented, sisters have had a bigger load placed on them in the family, in the community. And they're the ones who are up there crying when their babies are murdered. Fathers too, but it's the mothers who are most hurt. You're not supposed to be losing a child. And as the mother of Michael Brown said, she said, he graduated from high school. He was a good boy. And then she said, and then you go and just murder him. She said, this is what leads a lot of our youth not to have any hope. And so it was this flame, this fire that got ignited based on the value of a human life, Black humanity, which is not treasured. All these sisters and kids and some boys that have been kidnapped and for years have been taken into white hands, probably prostituted, who knows what, no effort made to even find them, no care about them. But when one white girl gets lost and then found, and the white boy who did the killing, they let him go. They knew darn well if he comes back in her vehicle, she's not there, something's happened. Let a Black person do that, see what happens. You know, suddenly we got all this focus on one person. She's lost her life, and that's tragic. But the fact is, where's the focus on Black lives? Do they matter? Well, they matter to us. And your life is the most precious thing you got, so you protect it. And later, for being too nice, if you figure your opponent is getting ready to do something to you, then you should have enough value for this life to stand up for it. Because if you're going to die down on your knees, it's better to die standing up, unless you use the knee in a different way, which we'll be talking about in a minute. Now, the African Lodge, founded by Prince Hall, that became later the Prince Hall Grand Lodge and now the Prince Hall Grand Masons, it was a stabilizing force when Blacks were first building institutions in the 1700s. And it helped stabilize Black families. It helped stabilize Black businesses. It helped stabilize Black religious institutions. And so that was the point made last week in looking at the Prince Hall Grand Masons. Now, the hostile forces that have hit Black communities since the post-1968 period has put us in a position of choosing between two cultures without often us being conscious of this. And this underlies what faces us with the Black Lives Matter movement. Because what we've had is the networks that transmit culture, extended family community, nuclear family community, have been severely weakened. The institution of elderhood has been severely weakened. And then when drugs are brought into the community, that is designed to destabilize you. And the intelligence agencies, as I pointed out before, as most of you know, they did that deliberately to try and shift the movement of Black youth away from liberation action into gangsterism. And so now it's become, for some of our people, a part of the culture. You know, I'm supposed to be hip to be a gangster. You know what I mean? Call me an OG. As I pointed out, I ain't no OG, original gangster. There ain't nothing original about being a gangster, number one. Number two, I'm an OR, I'm an original revolutionary. You hear me? And that is original. I'm out to help reshape the thoughts and reshape the systems that oppress our people. So if we look again, then at the Black Lives Matter movement, that's a massive democratic upsurge. And in fact, that threw Trump out of office, because the people, when our people finally get mad enough, we go off, but we do it collectively. It's like unplanned in the beginning, but it's like it couldn't have been better had it been systematically planned. And then because our power is underestimated both by us and our opponents, they don't really realize the significance of where this is going. Now, our conscious people do. Trump in the beginning didn't realize that this is kind of like, Dracula. Well, now, this is the stake that's going in your heart, buddy. Huh? When blacks rise up at that point, and then after all your mismanagement and stupidity and everything else, you frayed enough of your base to also come with us, even though you brought in 5 million more, it would knock you out of the White House, preparing you, as I pointed out in one of my shows, for the jailhouse. And hopefully he'll get it. We'll see. But if not, he's going to be running in the next presidential election campaign. And again, you the ones that have the key to sealing his fate again. So these upsurges were democratic expressions. And while we have the hashtag Black Lives Matter and different, forces coming together, many networks and everything else, it's really the masses of our people who make a collective decision that they're tired of this. They're not taking it anymore. It's like what black people did in Montgomery, Alabama, 97% standing up. Who could imagine that 50 states and 50 countries throughout the world will come out and knock Trump out of the White House? Who could imagine that? The same with, if we look at hip hop as a movement, we look at some of its most creative people, Kool Herc, Public Enemy, and many others. This is, again, a part of a democratic upsurge coming from the youth. With rhythm and blues going into decline, then what ends up happening is there's an innovation of what becomes hip hop, an extension of funk, outgrowth of rhythm and blues, inspired by James Brown, Malcolm X, Black Power. And if you look at Public Enemy, Chuck D's, his mother, member of the Black Panther Party, or Tupac, again, got those Panther influences. But it's a old new expression, again, using what? The word in this particular case. But it's a democratic expression of in the beginning, especially a high expression of art form that's in resistance. And it's coming out of the burning of the Bronx, where globalization is leading to jobs being shipped overseas. Communities now look like war zones. Absentee owners of big housing units are setting them on fire so that they can collect from the insurance companies. And Black people find themselves in a terrible position, and particularly the youth, the first generation of hip hoppers and those after it. They don't have the same prop to support a family, industrial jobs, good paying, all that, going out the window, And some of these youth are being recruited into gangs. And so hip hop became an alternative to that. And so, again, at the heart of this is a democratic expression. And with multiple leaders coming up, in this case, creators, and creating some beautiful art. And it's with the death of rhythm and blues. And there's a book called The Death of Rhythm and Blues, which is an excellent book. You should read it. And it shows how the Harvard report, which I discuss in the Integration Trap, The Harvard report was a study done by Harvard University on how they could profit from the Black market, that is the market of Blacks who buy records, in this case, rhythm and blues, how they could examine how rhythm and blues companies had made their money and brought in hundreds of millions of dollars in profit, how they could then transfer that to white companies. That was basically what the Harvard report was. And then it led to, because Harvard, again, being your upper scaled system, educational system, they use their brain power to support oppression. And so in this particular case, they're doing studies to show how they could mainstream rhythm and blues and kill it, but mainly make some money off of it. And so they begin to buy off Black artists and stuff from Motown and other Stax and other Black recording companies, and then recording them a few times. They would hire a few Blacks inside of their Black component of the white record label. And then after that, phase them out and tell them they're passe. You understand? And that was a part of phasing out rhythm and blues. And then, of course, with the death of Martin Luther King, rhythm and blues was an expression of the Black freedom movement. It was an expression of the music of the Black freedom movement, which was gospel turned into blues, rhythm and blues. It was kind of the flip of what Thomas Dorsey had done, you know, turning gospel, mixing it with blues, coming up with spirit blues, you know, which gives you Mahalia Jackson and Aretha Franklin and, you know, a host of others. So what ends up happening here is with the King, with the murder of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the spirit that inspired singers like Curtis Mayfield, you know, in his song, We're Moving On Up, you know, those who are blacker than blue. Curtis Mayfield, who was a real message singer. With the death of King, who represented the radical wing of the Black freedom movement and had a lot of people in the movement questioning him because the movement itself was in a state of confusion, as we pointed out when we did the show with Menu Ampin on King. So at this point, the movement is floundering. And so the creators who are being inspired in the art form in rhythm and blues, they're losing their direction. And so we see Curtis Mayfield, who is the messenger of protest music, now being the messenger for Superfly, you know? And the Ankh, which is a symbol of life, now becomes the symbol for smoking dope, sniffing dope, you know? And for a lot of Blacks who didn't know what an Ankh was in the first place, that's their first introduction to an African symbol, a symbol of death. So this movement had shifted gears. And what ends up happening is the Ella Baker wing of the movement, the group-centered leadership wing of the movement, now has more relevance because the Kings, the Malcolms, they had made great contributions and they had been taken out. And now, because a year after King's death, communities are really shifting. And so if he was able to really be relevant after that, he not only had to have a message that was Northern, not just Southern, and a method for organizing that was Northern, not just Southern, and he hadn't come up with that. But he was now going to be faced with, as Malcolm would had he lived, he's faced with more complex circumstances, circumstances that singular leaders can't handle. So this group-centered leadership model, so especially suited for complex conditions of breakdown, where you need specialists in a whole lot of different areas. Like you're hearing the need for healing. You need people who have the psychological insight on that, combined, as one of our viewers said, with understanding how we can do this in an African way. And I think that's real important, because the Western system of psychology used for healing doesn't really heal. It gets people into a more comfortable zone. It may allow them to be medicated. In some cases, that has to happen. If it's paranoia, schizophrenia, they're going to need some medication. I am not saying they should. But the fact is, Africans on the continent have a way of healing this. And that's because spirit is connected to whatever is out of balance. And we know it's an out of balance society that creates out of balance internally, that creates what's called mental illness or imbalance, psychological imbalance. It's the imbalance in society. It's a wonder that we all aren't nuts, based on that. So this formula of group-centered leadership is especially suited for complex circumstances. And today, when we're looking at Republican governors using their power to strip Blacks, brown, and young people, anybody's going to vote against them, but especially Black and brown, especially Blacks, of the right to vote through voter ID, through closing down a whole lot of places where you can vote, to shifting the power to do the final count to the people that Trump was trying to get to do the recount the last time. And for people who say, well, this thing about the election was stolen, well, that's wrong. Of course it's wrong. But there are two things about this election was stolen thing. There are whites who believe that, right? But there are many who mean by that, it was stolen because Blacks could vote. It was stolen because browns could vote. That was what was stolen. This should just be a white election. It should be a dummy election. You know what I mean? And so Trump is now setting the stage for a comeback that will be legal theft. If these spineless Democrats and the mass of Blacks and some browns don't do something about it, because they will have stolen enough votes that no matter how many of you come out, it's going to be hard. And I'm not trying to discourage the Black vote, because Blacks, we are very creative. So we're going to come up with stuff just like we did the last time. So this is real key. And again, it's the power of the collective, and it's the creativity of the collective that will really resolve this. Going back to Amilcar Cabral, he made a very perceptive assertion when he said that a people's chance for achieving liberation is measured by the qualitative difference between the culture of the oppressed and the culture of the oppressor. And so in talking about this democratic quality, this is a qualitatively different feature of our culture as opposed to theirs. What they call democracy in this country isn't democracy, it's a Republican government. Its goal is to control the people. That's what Madison said. But the goal of this consensus-based democracy, which is key to our culture, is for the people to be in control. We reject the idea of anybody controlling us. That's why the slave mantra in slavery was, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. The masses of Blacks never accepted slavery. And those of you who are using the psychological analysis to define how Blacks saw stuff, then you don't know what you're talking about, because they African, baby. And African is, you don't only have a say-so, you're a divinity. God's in you. Nobody has the right to subject you to anything that's wrong. And God would never do that. So they come out of a tradition of that. It's bred in them. And so that makes them resistant. That makes them a people who, no matter how hard the situation is, no matter how abused they get, no matter, as one sister said when we first started to do this show, no matter how broken they may feel, they ain't accepting that. That's your culture. And there's a lot of things that contribute to that, spirit being one. But this democratic thing where you're the power, this is key. And by the way, I pointed this out before, the African belief that you pick your destiny in heaven, in the presence of God, which means that your very life is powerful because, and I do believe we all picked being who we are. I don't think we picked catching all this hell. We may have picked some trials that we take in life. But what's interesting is with the Igbo, they say that when they were picking their destiny in heaven, they actually had an argument with God, meaning they debated over it. They took their democracy to heaven. But the very idea that you would pick your destiny is, again, saying something on the spiritual level. That's in spiritual democracy. That's in spiritual power, which means that you picked your mama. We talked about this before. One sister sent in a comment saying, yeah, all these people who complained about their mothers, they picked them, ha ha. She did a ha ha. Yeah, guess what? And then what about your children? They picked you, and they're going to come up with some of the same complaints you had with your mother and your father, you know what I mean? Or new ones. But it didn't mean they made the wrong choice. Nothing in life is perfect. We learn from imperfection, even though I'm a perfectionist. I have to say that. I got to remind myself, So this ability of Black folks to go inside themselves and draw on their own power, that is key. This is the democratic urge. Now, in the case of Colin Kaepernick, he's a real illustration of the power of our people in motion. When our people use this democratic expression to empower ourselves to resist oppression, we have effects on people. If you look at Muhammad Ali and his stand against going to Vietnam, it was in the context of a Black freedom movement. He had joined the Nation of Islam, and one of the key features, good features of the nation was Elijah had refused to fight in World War II and been put in prison for it. So they actually supported that kind of anti-war protest, but that ain't why he did it. He did it because he was standing on principle. And he did it in spite of everything that could hurt him. But he did it in the context of a Black freedom movement, a Black power movement. And that is what set the climate for him. And when you look at Colin Kaepernick, it's the same thing. It's in the context of a broader movement that has an influence on a multi-million-dollar professional football player who was a second-round draft for the 49ers in 2011, and who took him to the Super Bowl in 2012. Now, that's a big achievement. The guy's a heck of a good athlete and smart. So in the context of this movement that is based heavily on group-centered leadership and democracy, standing up against what's wrong, Colin Kaepernick comes along. And what's often ignored is he's taken Black studies classes at UCLA. And he's plunging into his history. And, his mother's white, Kaepernick. How many Black people got that name? You know what I mean? And so he's dealing with his own issues of identity, I'm sure. And he's studying his history, and his eyes are being opened up. And in part through this Black studies movement, that sticks up in universities historical information that you wouldn't otherwise get, And what I would say is the combination of seeing Black men and women shot down by the police and seeing a movement rising up against it. And then being able to contextualize this by studying his history and his culture. Colin Kaepernick was going through disturbance, which is a key stage in the sixfold stages to mental freedom. I went through it. That's key to your awakening. You hear me? I went through it when I realized how this system really worked. That is what put me into a deep oh shit moment, you know, and he had his. And so as he's seeing this, it's beginning to trigger an awakening. And he's interviewed by a reporter at one point, and he's asked about the conditions that Blacks face in the Black community. It's in the context of this movement, this Black Lives Matter movement. And his response was something like this: there are too many Blacks dying out there, meaning he's identifying, you know, with the victims, his own people. Guy who's making millions of dollars, you know, who's got himself, who knows what kind of a future, because in the end, it's going to be brain damage. That may be one of the best things for him of getting out of football, even though he wants to get back in. But he is saying something, and especially in football, of all the professional sports, is about as racist as you can get. He's saying that he's identifying with the suffering. He's identifying with those who are bleeding, those who are being stomped on by the police. And by implication, he's saying he's not identifying with the racist coaches and owners. Uh-oh. He's stepping out into a realm that they don't want him to step out into. And so what we're seeing is there's an awakening in the sixfold stages. This is an experience. This isn't something out of a textbook. We're describing what it is, but this is an experience. He's undergoing an experience. He's changing. And what is key is, with this awakening process, which is, by the way, the sixfold stages of mental freedom, when we tie it into the African culture that we've recreated here, I call it New African, democratic, spirit-based, a whole bunch of other things. This is a new innovation in that consciousness gets changed through oppression. And so as a result of that, we begin to see a lot of things differently. And the sixfold stages is tracking it, but also showing how you can move from one stage to the other. And generally, if you're going to rise higher and higher, then the key to that rise is your identification with something higher than yourself. And when we were talking about last week, the Prince Hall Lodge and Prince Hall Grand Lodge, one of the reasons why that institution has been able to be the longest standing institution of Blacks in this country and embracing a broad cross-section of membership is it's embraced high principles. It's rested itself on the highest principles known to humanity. And when you're in the midst of a struggle and you're undergoing change, what really enables you to undergo that change is you're committing yourself to something beyond yourself, something bigger than yourself, something more important than yourself. And everyone that's involved in a collective freedom movement, they all say it's the most important experience of their life. It shaped them. And so Colin Kaepernick, like Black Lives Matter, like the movements that have preceded them, the Black Panther Party, Black Power, a host of others, Nat Turner and his resistance, whatever, he is beginning to make decisions about what's important. What's he going to center his life on? And he begins to draw on this high principle that our mothers teach our children. They don't use the word, but they teach the same thing, that our families rest on, our communities rest on. And it is this principle of truth. It is this principle of justice. It's this principle of freedom. What the Kemites call the rudder of heaven and the beam of earth. The rudder that gives direction to heaven and the cosmos. And the beam, which is the central part of a building that is the foundation for earth. He's drawing on some big principles. We call that Ma'at, but you don't have to know the name. It's the principle that matters. Now, of course, if you know the name, it's even better, but living it is the key. And so he's beginning to make decisions about his commitment. And this commitment is tied to his identification of siding with the people who are pressed against the oppressor. So as he begins to take a stand on truth, that's going against his career. That's going against the money. That's going against his future, you know, as a professional football player. And he may not be conscious of this in the very beginning, but he becomes conscious of it later. And when he decides to take the knee after this interview where he says a lot of Blacks are dying, his decision to kneel during the national anthem, he interprets it as a mild form of protest because it's kneeling as opposed to putting your fist up or some other symbol that whites have already indicated they don't support or respect. He didn't expect to get the hostile response that he got, you know, but he was protesting. But, you know, he thought that, well, you know, kneeling, you know, in front of the flag, I mean, you might interpret this as reverence for the flag, huh? Except that this was the cause for opposing violence, police violence against Blacks, supporting a movement that had exploded around this. And so immediately, everything comes down on his head. And he's surprised. And then he gets demands that he backs off, demands that he be fired. He gets old Donald Trump, who's running for president, saying we need to make America great again and get rid of this guy, you know, get rid of all of them. You know, this was Trump in the White House and before the White House. And his response is, again, he didn't expect this harsh response. But what does he do? He mans up. He was already manning up, but now he's really manning up and he says, well, this is Colin Kaepernick. He says, well, referring to Trump, he says, make America great again. He goes on and says, well, America has never been great for people of color. That's something that needs to be addressed. And then he says, let's make America great for the first time. That's kind of like what Michelle Obama said, you know, when she said, well, with her husband's nomination, this was the first time she was really proud of America. She slipped and said the truth, you know what I mean? Because she went through that Harvard grinder and then she asked herself always a question. Could she go out of that and still be useful for her people? And so she was really stating the truth, you know what I mean? That she hadn't seen anything this country had done that made her proud before, you know? And so this was kind of the comment of Colin Kaepernick. Now, there's a key principle of African-American culture that Kaepernick was also expressing. It wasn't just the sixfold stages to mental freedom. Kaepernick was put in a position where he thought the response to his protest would be one thing, and it ended up being another. And so he had to improvise. He had a choice. He could have started standing up, or he could have changed his form of protest, but he kept on kneeling. He kept his knee to the ground. And through a whole season, with hell coming down on his head, you know, he was demonstrating the other key principle in our culture, which is this principle of freedom, and particularly creating something on the spur of the moment. That whole kneeling movement was a spur of the moment movement, not expecting what would happen. And then drawing from the key quality of creativity, which is on the spur of the moment, you come up with something. In this case, it's kneeling, you know. Don't get the response you get, but you man up and you decide you're going to keep on doing it no matter what. Well, the keep on doing it no matter what was an expression of the key component of improvisation, which is discipline and freedom. If you're going to pursue something, you'd better be disciplined. And he was disciplined. And this discipline took courage. Muhammad Ali, it took courage. He was giving up the best part of his career. If Colin Kaepernick ever gets to play, and I don't think he will, but if he does, he's probably past the prime, you know? Probably the best that he could do is maybe past. And hopefully, I hope they don't hire him, because I'd like to see him whole. I don't want to see his brain damaged and everything else that happens with professional football. But the key point is, he was an expression of this principle of freedom, the principle of creativity. And what was he doing there? Presenting something beautiful, because for us, freedom is our expression of creativity. We create, and that is our expression of freedom to what? Bring beauty into the world. And so he brought some beauty into the world, you know, Colin Kaepernick. I respect the brother. And I can see he's digging deeper and looking at himself. And while some money has been showered on him, that was not his objective. And he's doing a lot to help a lot of Black folks. So I really respect him. And when his mother came down on his head, he didn't even seem to blink, coming up there criticizing him. You know what I mean? Yeah, well, she's white. You know what I mean? But Colin he didn't even call her out or nothing. You know, he just kept on. Yeah, Mom, you know, I get where you're coming from. This is me. I'm Black, baby. I'm waking up, baby. You hear me? I'm bringing about some change, baby. You know what I mean? And Mr. Kyle Irvin, don't try and put yourself in his category. You ain't in his category. You want to protest getting your shot, and you want to give up your career, that's your business. You know what I mean? That you're not pursuing truth there. You're pursuing some confusion. So in concluding this, at a time when the clouds of oppression hover over us, inside of us dwells this light of the beautiful truth. This light of the beautiful truth that comes out of the culture of Africa and has been retransplanted into the souls of Black folks in America, and has been continued by Black folks in the Caribbean, and is mothered at the source of Mother Africa. And so it is that's what we have to draw on. It's a deep well. It's the most precious set of possessions you have. It's your sweet inspiration. It comes in the form of the lady you or the man you love, your children, your family, because that is the manifestation of your culture. But it comes particularly through what you decide to dedicate your life to. What's central to you? What's most important is your own people, your own people. And the cause of justice that you pursue on behalf of your own people, that's the most important thing to me. I told my wife once, I said, she's very conscious and she loves herself as I love myself. I said, well, baby, you got to understand something. I love my people more than I love myself. I've told you this before, but I'm going to say this to you, but I ain't stupid. That don't mean I love everyone more than I love myself, because I don't know everyone. But as a group, I love the group more, because the group is the source from where I come from. Everyone in the group may not be lovable. It's far from it for some. I mean, when they've sent assassins to take me out, they were always, my color, but it wasn't blacks that sent them. I knew that, you know what I mean? So your life is meaningful to the extent that you've dedicated to something bigger than yourself. And this beautiful culture that you have is a treasure. We need to polish it. As a people, we need to know it, because this new African culture is something that a lot of us are doubtful about. Some of us know, none of us fully know. I don't claim to be an expert on this whole culture because it's so complex. It's the most complex culture in this country, and I believe in the world. And I don't think any one person is going to get the whole of it. But it is the source of your power. It is what produces the chain reaction that happened, around the Floyd murder, Breonna Taylor murder. It created the chain reaction because of the beauty of our stand-up. I mean, the beauty of our culture, whatever we do, standing on truth and justice, it adds to the world. It doesn't just help us, it helps humanity. And so that's why I know I chose to be Black. And some people say, yeah, but look at your shade and all the rest of the, well, I don't know anything about that. I know that I picked my mother and my father, and if this is what came out, fine, because my father was one of the best men that I've ever known in my life, and my mother was one fine woman. And so I'm happy with the choice. You hear me? But I wouldn't choose it any other way. And I know I made this choice. What would I be doing? Choosing to be the oppressor? No, I choose to be somebody who's out here as a part of a people who's not only resisting this, but is creating an alternative to this, so that our young people will have not only a better future, but a just one. So Hotep, as usual, I enjoy this. By the way, sometimes I can't figure out what this show's going to be till Thursday, because I'm also writing, I'm working out. And then when I went to the gym Friday, then I just ran it through, because, the endorphins kick in. So, you can run it through. You're hitting that, those weights and doing this running and stuff. And then I came in. And so all Friday, I was laying this show out for Saturday. So this is some work here. You know what I mean? And by the way, one brother in particular has volunteered to do some things to improve this show. And I'll be talking about him more later. He's also suggested that I need for this show some people who are willing to volunteer to help with the chat, who can be a part of the chat and can also help people in the chat formulate questions. And of course, those of you who know this better than I do know that there are other things that people who do this do. So I could use some help on that. And by next week, based on suggestion that I've received from you, we'll be joint streaming this show on YouTube and Facebook, because I have a pretty good following that's developing on Facebook, and they are the largest group that watches YouTube. but a lot of people who watch Facebook don't watch YouTube. And so we're going to be doing that. And there's a number of other things we're doing to push this show up and generate more viewers. So we could use help from you. So if you've got ideas for how to improve the show, send them to me. You make the comments under the show, you can do it, or you can send me at otashaka@sbcglobal.net. Send me your ideas, because a lot of you know more about how this operates than I do. I'm just learning this stuff. I mean, people are coming up to me telling me I need to do this and that. And I said, what is that? I'm old school in a new environment, so I'm just trying to adapt so I can use your help. And by the way, I want to say to my wife, she's much better at some of this stuff than me. And she's the first one that encouraged me from the very beginning to do my own show, because I was working with someone else for about 1.5 years. She's saying, doing your own show, do your own show. So I have to give my wife credit. She saw what I was going to do before I even decided to do it. Now, that's a real good wife. You know what I mean? Got more insight than you. Right on. Pam, I want to say thank you. You should know I appreciate it, but in this particular case, especially so. So let's see what we got here in comments. Shepsu Heru, big brother, I salute you. One question off subject. Some people say that when you die, you should follow the light, and others say you shouldn't. You must remain in the dark. What do you think? Now, of course, this is and isn't off subject. This certainly isn't what we covered today. My understanding of the afterlife is this, that when you pass on to the other side, there is a great light, and that there's instantaneous judgment that occurs. Your car has a memory of everything you've done, and so your car gives an account, and that really determines whether what you've done in this life is more positive or more negative, and that determines where you're going. There's this pit that's not so nice, that the Christians and Muslims and people of Judaism call hell, and other systems call hell. And I do believe people that get that way and go there. And then there are people that go through the light that go to the heavenly realm. And there's enough account of this for me to think that this is accurate. My sister, when my father passed, she saw this great golden light just come into the room. And that was at the moment in which he passed. So I do believe that's true. And I don't know if the place where you're going to hell is actually a dark spot or not, but it is an unpleasant spot. And enough people who are into parapsychology who see this, who are gifted, they see it. They say it's not a good place to be. Okay, let's see if we got any other things. Seems like we got a lot of inner chats going on here, which is, I understand what happens with this. There's one brother here says, Roja me, he bright skinned, but his eyes dark as night. And then look at his nose. Trust me, you're not going to fool nobody. This is what I teach my son. Yeah, you're darn right. I don't have no issues on color. I know I'm black. My family had no issues on it, so I don't have an issue, but I just made that as an off comment. Let's see. It's Brother Ogawa that has made some suggestions for improving the show and is going to be helping to make this show better. And you got more that want to do that. I look forward to that. Help me out. Help. I could use help. Let's see. Roja Me, you don't have to be racist to love your people, and you do not have to be a suspect in order to fight for the victim. You be what some call heroes. Yeah, right. Let me see. Lynn Mosley, Baba Tashaka, that awakening you mentioned accelerated for me, Ray, knowing how the system really works after studying the Phoenix program in the CIA as organized crime by Douglas Valentine. That's a good point. What Brother Lynn Dream Child Mosley is saying is his exposure to the savagery of oppression, in this case through the Phoenix program, which is a program carried out by the CIA in Vietnam. It was torture, it was terrible stuff. It helped accelerate his awakening. And it triggers disturbance and anger. And there's nothing wrong with being disturbed and angry when you're oppressed. There's something wrong when you aren't. You know what I mean? Gladys Harris, can we people say and or make better decisions to make America great for colors, for people of color? Yeah, and I think the more we study, the more we know. The more we study about our history and culture, the more we know about the system and how it works, the more we can begin to conceive of ways to improve this system. And I always say the systems we come up with that can promote justice and freedom, these are systems we can create now. Don't be waiting until everything changes. So that's a good point, good comment. Tito District, he says it looks like the same thing that happened to R&B is currently happening to the hip hop industry today. Yeah. One of the key things with art forms is because it's operating under a capitalist system, of course, they come to try and make money off of it. The artists do too. And the question is, are you able to maintain your integrity in your art form? And the corporate system will always be trying to reduce it to the lowest common denominator possible. And we know gangster rap was one form, though I understand what some of these people who are in the gangster rap say, and that they're talking about real life. But it's taken to the point that we're acting like gangsterism is the life. And then a whole lot of other stuff that comes into us that is negative and is being treated as normal. So yeah, that's a real struggle that we have to make. But it's sticking to the high road and it's sticking to your creativity. There's a lot of inner talk here, so let's see if there's any question. King Pianki, a true leader is not isolated from the people. A true leader is inseparable from the people. He's quoting Kwame Ture, Kwame Nkrumah. Yeah, true. Gladys, Gladys Harris, can Black people so look at the whole picture and do nothing low to help Black folks? Yeah, well, it's a question of if you see the whole picture or a good part of it, what are you going to do with that? That's your choice. And that's really the choice called life. So that's our choice. Gladys Harris, do Blacks care about survive, or people which groups are most enlightening? Let me see, what is that? What does that mean? Do Blacks care about survive or people? I guess the real question is, do we care about survival? Of course we do. But the question is, what are the methods we're using? And is survival good enough? And enlightening, and I guess she's suggesting that our groups have to offer some enlightenment. Yeah, that's true. Let's see if there's anything else in there. Comments in here about language and knowing different languages and speaking to white people in a language they understand. What was it? Male. Roger me, 6 points again. I was at the male and female, but that was only the third point. What's the other one again? The basic points we're making today was on democracy, the African basis for democracy, and how it's written in African American culture. The twinlineal system, which is a male-female system, and the transformational system, sixfold stages. Sun Temple, thanks, brother. Roja, I mean, so this apparently was a conversation. I mean, when you got a gathering of people and someone commits a crime, normally they blame the leader. So if a person who followed Martin Luther King actually hurt someone, would he be considered guilty? You mean, would King be considered guilty? I assume you mean. No, unless he's operating on some principle he was taught that was wrong. No. Tito has a question. This is the only question I've seen so far. Baba Tashaka, what are some of the tools and methodologies one can use to survey the social structures in a society or community? Now, that's a real good question. Good question. Right now, I'm doing some work on social structure, particularly class structure in the white community, because I'm looking at who rules America, how does it work, and so forth. And the same thing can be used for our own social structure. I personally think that when it comes to the national group that's used to try and control Blacks, called the Black Establishment, Lerone Bennett's analysis is the best. Needs to be updated, but not that much. So in this question of what are some of the tools and methodologies one can use to survey the social structure in a society or community, I've used surveys a lot in the past, not recently, but in the past. When certain events come down, like when the Jim Jones deaths occurred in Guyana, but it wasn't just that, but I was looking at what was behind that. We surveyed a couple of hundred people to figure out what was behind that. And it revealed a lot more than what people thought, going to people directly, people that knew the people who were in Jonestown, for example. So surveys that pick a sample that's large enough to be representative of a group of people and a particular issue that you're studying. So that's one. And there's a lot of material on that. A lot of people do that, but not too many are that interested in going to everyday Black people to find out what they think. And the key thing is, I think in research is to really respect oral research. That is the wisdom of the people, going to the people and getting their views directly from them. I think one of the best ways to study social structure is, especially when people are in motion, when they're engaged in a struggle, that is most revealing, because then you get to see the stands that different sectors in society will take. For Blacks, different sectors of Blacks. What's the church's position on this? And then you're going to see it's not one position. You're going to see different people are tied to different parts of the system. Some are independent. So same thing if you're analyzing the white power elite, watching how the power elite moves in a crisis reveals more than any other time. For example, COVID-19, when you watch how the corporations moved on the money, you knew they were going to do that. Which ones did? That tells you something. Or when you're seeing that a certain kind of legislation is coming through Congress that's very repressive, tracing, where does that come from? You know, like the head of the Senate, the Republican head of the Senate is a right-wing Republican. And he comes out of the Koch brothers. So if you know the Koch brothers, then you're going to know a whole lot about what his motivation is. So it's a lot like that. And it's also studying what hasn't been studied. But watch how people from different sectors in society react to different things. A question here is, what was the name of the last recommended book? Let's see, what were the books I was referring? I basically referred to Chancellor Williams' Destruction of Black Civilization and Rebirth of African Civilization. That's basically what I referred to. I also referred to my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, which is the source of the twin lineal analysis. Question here is, what's up with the rite of passage? Why is it good and why is it bad? Roja, that's from Roja. We need more rites of passage programs now. I don't know if people heard these others, because I see when I went on this, I went mute. I didn't realize it. So people could let me know below if they heard anything I was saying. So positive aspects of rites of passage is if they're thorough, they're really helping you transition boys and girls from girlhood and boyhood to manhood and womanhood. And so they got to be rigorous and thorough and transformational. And you got to make them interesting for kids to really want to be in them. So that's a whole nother story. The negatives, I don't see, well, the negatives are if they're surface and they are not really going into depth and encourage transformation. You know? So right now, let's see. This is a brother from Bristol in the UK. Said they still remember the last visit I had to the UK. So down on the bottom, scroll and let me know, could you hear the responses I had to the other questions? Okay. So he said he could hear it all. Okay, that's it. So I want to thank you. I've enjoyed this a lot. I hope you all have got a lot out of this. And I want to say, Hotep.